Welcome to History 111, Lecture 33, Challenges to Slavery. Now, in the previous lecture, we talked about a lot of ways in which American society was trying to make itself better. But this widespread impulse for reform ultimately emerges by about 1833 with abolitionism at the front. Now, the early abolitionists tend to take the form of moral disapproval, and there's little direct opposition to slavery at first. Now, the North does abolish slavery, but it's never really all that entrenched, and the only other major progress is that the international slave trade is banned after 1808. Now, gradualism was a very popular idea within the North, and the idea was that slavery would end a bit at a time. Freedom would be purchased, and this was really an attempt to deal with slavery without offending Southerners. And it focused, at this point, really on the idea that slavery was an evil influence on white society, and for the good of white society, they had ought to get rid of it, one little piece at a time, and were they to buy everyone's freedom, the Southerners would eventually come around. Now, early organized opposition to slavery really revolved around an idea called colonization, and that even takes on a little bit of popularity within the South as well. Now, the American Colonization Society was founded primarily by prominent Virginians, including people like Robert E. Lee. And what they're going to do is they're going to raise money to purchase freedom for people and transport the freed slaves to Africa. Now, the ACS settlements, along with other similar ones, are eventually going to become the nation of Liberia in 1846 with its capital at Monrovia. Now, the colonization efforts had negligible results. They never really raised all that much money, and the cotton boom at the time was also creating an increased demand for slave labor. Many African Americans also had no desire to move to Africa, so this was an effective dead end for combating slavery, because there were less slaves transported in a single decade than were born in a single month, and it was logistically impossible to carry out a large enough effort to even really dent slavery at this point. As the debate over slavery grows, however, the idea of immediate emancipation really takes hold, and an important person there is William Lloyd Garrison, who begins publishing a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, and he advocated a radically different way of looking at the issue. Abolitionists up to this point had concentrated on how this affected white society. Garrison advocated looking at how the institution affected slaves. Garrison attracted a big following that really led to the creation of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he really helped revitalize abolitionism as a reform issue. There's about 250,000 free blacks in the United States at this point, and they're mostly in cities where they're subjected to intense racism, poverty, and were often denied fundamental rights. And a lot of these people were attracted to the abolitionist cause, and many of them were Garrison's early subscribers and really helped make the newspaper a success. What it really underlies is, for these individuals, as long as slavery as an institution exists anywhere within the United States, they are never going to be able to receive their true civil liberties even in the North. There are a number of black abolitionists, but two you should definitely know about are Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Now, Frederick Douglass is a major figure in the North, and he publishes a book about his life called A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and he also begins publishing a newspaper called the North Star. And these are publications that really show slavery in a truthful but also very negative light, and really are used as methods to sort of educate people about the institution and call for its abolition. Sojourner Truth was an important individual in that she's the first black woman to ever take a white man to court and win. And she really advocates Western immigration and the creation of a separate state for freed slaves. And her whole idea is that really, with America being the way it was at this point in time, living separately but free might be a better solution. Now, the abolitionists realize we're a dissenting minority, and they do not have a unified vision of the best way to proceed beyond simply ending the institution of slavery. Now, even in the North, the idea is not greeted with universal support. A lot of people fear the consequence of emancipation. Some feel it would lead to civil war. Others feel it will lead to a mass exodus of African Americans to the North. There's a lot of racism in the country at this time, and no one knows quite what the consequence will be of emancipation, and they're not sure how they would be able to build a functional society out of that. And that's why we see people like Sojourner Truth advocating separation, and we're going to see other people advocating other different solutions as well. Now, do realize a lot of abolitionists were victims of violence, but they're not people who give up easily. But over time, their movement is going to fracture. Now, some people are going to become more extreme and funnel money to support violence, and John Brown is an important example, but we'll talk about him later. And some are going to prefer to see remedies in laws, and they're going to start petitioning Congress to ban the interstate slave trade. And one of the reasons they're doing that is, again, remember, there's large numbers of slaves being transported south and west to cotton growing states from the old tobacco growing states on the eastern seaboard. Now, abolitionism, though, is ultimately going to be taken over by what's called the free soil movement. And the free soil movement is not about ending slavery, but containing it. Now, some of the people in the free soil movement did care about the welfare of slaves, but most of them simply wanted to keep the new territories reserved for whites. And that position is ultimately going to attract widespread support in the North. And remember, just because people are against slavery doesn't mean they're not racist. One important event at this point is also the Amistad case. Now, this concerns a number of individuals who were captured in Sierra Leone, have been sold into slavery in Havana, and eventually mutiny and escaped. Now, they're captured by the U.S. Navy and brought to trial because they had killed all the different people on board this ship, and they were charged with piracy and murder. Now, the defense team is led by John Quincy Adams, who is now a former president of the United States, and ultimately, the court's ruling was that these were people were born free, and therefore they were not guilty because these people had no right to attempt to enslave them. And that decision is upheld by the Supreme Court in 1840. Now, while that was definitely the right decision for the Supreme Court to have made, this decision makes Southerners very nervous. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, we need to remember that there's deeply ingrained racism in both North and South. And just because people are advocating for an end to slavery does not mean they've overcome all their prejudice. Now, early on, this was about why it was bad for white people and why there should be gradual emancipation of the slaves. Now, Garrison's going to come along and he's going to reframe the argument about why it's bad for the enslaved people and why there needs to be an immediate end to this institution. Now, remember, this is not going to be universally supported and it's ultimately going to be overtaken by the free soil movement, which we'll talk about later. See you in the next lecture.